Welcome to the Digital Agency Growth Podcast. I'm your host, Dan Englander.
David, nice to have you.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me, Dan.
Yeah, absolutely. And we were just talking before I threw on the recorder, and it's funny how our audience are agency owners, many of which have been at this for decades at a time. And I don't think there's really anybody that needs to be sold on the power of relationships or the power of referrals. It's really just about what can you do to actually be deliberate and proactive about harnessing these things, as opposed to what pretty much everybody does, which is sitting around waiting for the phone to ring. So we'll definitely get into that. And it sounds like we're approaching a very similar problem from different angles. But before we do, would you mind talking a bit about your background from a high level?
Sure. Yeah, I've spent the last 25 plus years in mostly sales leadership roles, commercial leadership roles at various technology companies, early stage. I was a founder once before of a social media listening platform called Earshot. And then previous to launching SmallWorld, I was chief revenue officer of a voice analytics company based here in Chicago. Led a team of 80 plus sales, customer success, customer service folks to hone in on all the deal velocity metrics. And it was a great opportunity for me to see kind of what worked and what didn't, and really inspired this idea around warm introductions and referrals being this untapped opportunity to build more pipeline and really impact all of the velocity metrics.
That's interesting. And let's dig into that a little bit, just because there's so much fluff, I think, in the sales world. And there's so much kind of sometimes naive, over focus on metrics. And very few of which actually matter. And there's also a lot of people fooling themselves, either to sell things or just to tell stories. So to bring this to a question, hopefully, when you were at that, either the current company or maybe the previous one, what were those deal velocity metrics? What were the sorts of things that actually affected outcomes across a large data set in your experience?
Yeah, I mean, traditionally what I've seen is, one, just top of funnel production, right? Sheer number of opportunities. Two, average deal size. So that obviously impacts total revenue as well. And then you're looking at overall conversion rates, win-loss rates. Those are, super important. And then the last one is just average sales cycle. So how do we take a sales cycle of 180 days down to 90 days? And what does that look like? And if you hone in on those four metrics, it obviously impacts overall performance. And so that's what we really keyed in on, whether that was getting to more senior level people, whether that was asking the right questions throughout the sales process, whether that was activating new lead gen or demand gen strategies. All those things are really important to overall funnel performance.
That's interesting. And I kind of want to hone in on that last one, which is bringing sales cycle down, because that's something we get asked about a lot, right? Because maybe when you're in bigger teams with bigger organizations, it's not like some salesperson can just change up the product. But when you're in a boutique agency, you can package services a million different ways from Sunday. Can you talk about that a little bit? What were the factors that were actually bringing down sales cycle? Did it take repackaging the product, or is this all just the blocking and tackling of better sales practices? Or what were the sorts of forces that were impacting that?
Yeah, and it's interesting. There's been some recent statistics that have been posted, I think, on LinkedIn or Twitter around how these sales cycles are taking a lot longer in today's market, right? Budgets have been constrained and sales reps are facing this challenge probably more than ever. And so the compression of that sales cycle, there's a lot of different things can affect it. Of course, the quality of the salesperson and the questions they ask, but we found more than anything else, what level are you selling at? How quickly can you get to what I define as power? Somebody that actually has budget can make that decision. And, if you're selling sort of mid-level up, that can take a lot longer than if you have executive sponsorship from the beginning. And that can really accelerate the time in which, you can get a commitment. Part of, what inspired building SmallWorld and thinking about relationships is that you can accelerate the access that you have into those senior level decision makers. And those meetings that you can secure often happen within a couple of weeks instead of it taking, 6 to 8 weeks of cold outreach, because of a trusted relationship. So those activities really can impact the time to commitment, and obviously the basics of creating a sense of urgency, understanding the problem that you're solving, knowing what the business outcome is once that problem has been solved, are critical to articulate during the sales process.
Yeah, that makes sense. So to kind of shift gears a little to SmallWorld. Can you talk about was there a light bulb moment, that inspired it, where you're like, okay, this is the next project I'm working on?
I think the big thing for me is my previous startup, we had a really cool product. We actually delivered value and we had some users that loved it. but man, it was hard to quantify the specific business value that we were delivering. And even the end users that loved it said, wow, this is really great. This is helping me. And when we would try to really understand dollars and cents and a before and an after, it was hard. And I knew that these warm introductions and referrals truly changed business outcomes. There was a direct correlation between getting that intro and actually being able to close business. And that excited me because I knew that even in a crowded rev tech space, even with a lot of different tools, ultimately the reps care about two things. One being, how big is my pipeline and what's the quality of my pipeline? Because those two things will impact overall revenues that they produce, and then that affects how many commissions that they earn and their lifestyle and their kids' lifestyle. So I felt so strongly about the business impact that we could make with this that it made it easier for me to jump in and be excited about it.
Yeah, that makes sense. And can you talk a little bit about how most sales teams are thinking about relationships and referrals? Like without a tool like this and without any special processes, like usually what's the status quo in your experience?
Yeah, and that was another inspiration for us as we talked to a lot of companies before launching SmallWorld, and many of them are trying to do this, but they're still doing it on spreadsheets. They've got a spreadsheet that they distribute to their executive team, their board members. Hey, here's our top 50 for Q1. Does anybody know anyone at Nike, or does anybody know anybody at Verizon? And so that doesn't yield the optimal result because it's very reactive. There's no intelligence built into that spreadsheet. And so that's how it's been working. And it's also, when we think about like customer referrals, it's typically customer success reps doing quarterly business review and asking one of their customers if they know anybody else. When peer groups and peers of these advocates and ones that are willing to be references are sitting right there. So, making it easier for them to make these introductions and then thinking about the incentives and recognition that can take place is a big part of it to change the status quo.
Right. And in those situations, it's funny because like if you just say, do you know anyone, that now becomes like the hardest task for somebody to fulfill because they have to make sure that they feel comfortable introducing you to whoever they might have in common, but first come up with that idea and then come up with the intro, write it on top of like everything else that they have to do. So maybe we can go there. Like, can you talk about how you're typically recommending people activate these relationships and like what actually is a better way of doing it?
Well, we take a little bit of a different approach in that one, we make it really easy for connectors to be in control over the strength of their relationship. So they rate their relationships as very strong all the way to very weak. And we do it in such a way to where they're not burdened with rating all their relationships, just the ones that the sales team is really focused on. So specific people at specific target accounts that are in specific buying centers with specific titles. So we hone in on the personas that fit their ICP. And then we make that really easy for the connectors. And it's not a requirement of our system, but it certainly helps bring more fidelity to the networks of these connectors and makes that whole introduction process easier. We also go and retrieve things like work history, location. We look at intent data. And so what we do is we inform this new version of a spreadsheet, which we like to call a smart spreadsheet, that takes these things into account and makes it easy now for a connector to offer help into these places where alumni networks are really strong. And they know that if they offer help, it gets routed to the right salesperson, it gets captured and recorded, it's going to be tracked, and they'll be provided with status updates. So we're really reimagining the whole user experience so that the connector is able to participate in a way that they haven't been able to before.
Yeah. And to back up a little bit, can you talk about how you would define a connector? Could this be anybody? Is this somebody in the target account you want to reach, or is this just like a random colleague, friend in your own company outside of it, just what, or all the above?
So we think of a salesperson when they go through this process, they're naturally going to start with their own network, right? And they're going to have that in their own address book. They're going to have that probably on LinkedIn. And that's the natural place to start, but that ends pretty quickly. And so then this next layer of what we call connectors are those people within the ecosystem of their business who are either intrinsically motivated, like executives or board members or advisors, to make warm introductions. They're already doing it today, or those that are connected to the business that may even have incentives. So if we think about employees who get referral bonuses when someone gets hired, we're seeing companies now create these programs for referral bonuses if a warm introduction leads to new business. And so when we think of, and when I say connectors, we're really referring to those different cohorts. It's partners, it's customers, it's former employees, it's current employees, it's executives, advisors, anybody within the ecosystem of the business. And then the third place that a rep will go is there's a stranger that actually has a very strong relationship with somebody that I'm trying to meet, and I've got a timely, relevant request that will resonate with them, that will actually help them invest in their relationship and build social capital with that person that they know. And so we're about ready to avail this later this quarter or early next, where we'll have an external network that will enable all of that to happen. But we're going to be very judicious with how we do it. Relationships are a precious thing. That trust needs to be retained. Anonymity needs to be recognized. There's all, the non-competitive issues. So we're taking all those things into consideration. But our mission as a company is to give sales and marketing teams the tools and technology to engage any target prospect at any company that they identify.
That makes sense. And, a lot of our listeners know about some of the work we're doing, where we're kind of doing this in a more kind of done for you way, where we're essentially mapping connections, doing the actual outreach to get these sorts of things. And you're approaching this more from the software angle, which is awesome. And one thing that we found is it works really, really well. And but then when people get on the calls with their connectors sometimes, because what we found is that like that connector meeting will often have to happen in order to get the best sorts of most relevant intros. And it adds more time, but it's really worth it. Sometimes our clients will say, some clients are used to doing this all day, but then people that are kind of newer at the sorts of people that are kind of happened into referrals will say things like, yeah, the call was a little awkward because I felt uncomfortable asking for the intro, or, I saw they know these people that I want to reach, and I felt a little weirder about it. Is there a way that you've found to deal with that, or that and I know if you have like a boiler room salesperson, they probably don't have an issue with that, but the people that do have issues, like how do you approach that problem?
Well, it's one of the reasons why we took the approach of treating the connectors experience in SmallWorld as just as important as a salesperson, because a lot of the relationship intelligence tools you'll find will create a score, right? They'll guess at what their relationship strength is, and then the rep is sort of going through the same process. So for our connectors, they've willingly become part of the system. They typically will be willing to do so because we've made their user experience easier. We have everything from templates built into the system to reminders, and they don't have to do much. There isn't like this dependency that they spend a lot of time on it, but they're already a part of it. And so what we've done is we've removed a lot of the ambiguity of getting this unexpected email or in-mail from a rep asking for this warm intro. So to your question, the rep who hesitates no longer has to, because they know this is a connector who is a part of SmallWorld. As important, we'll typically have relationship strength. And when we see that the connector has a strong or very strong relationship into the target prospect, we are showing that well over 50% of the time that meeting will happen. So about 83% of the time they'll say, yes, I'm willing to make that introduction. And a little over 71% of the time it actually meeting gets scheduled. And so the net is around 56%, I think. It's astounding. And so that's where reps sort of get more comfortable with it. Is it's like, all right, if my conversion rate is this, and these connectors are actually expressing to me that they have this strength in the relationship, their willingness to help is already intact, and I feel less uncomfortable doing so.
Right. That makes sense. And I think the other part of that is if you give somebody more specifics and you make it easy, it's not a huge deal compared to just this gray area, open-ended, do you know anybody kind of situation.
And that just add to that, what we've seen is we've built into our system, you can create a ghost email, right? That can be forwarded by the connector. They'll often say, hey, I'm happy to make the introduction to, Kristen, but can you send me something I can forward? So we've made that whole process simple, where with a couple clicks, connector on their mobile device can make that introduction without having to do very much.
Yeah, that's huge. I think still, relationships are always going to be complicated. And like one of the hardest things is like quantifying the strength of a relationship, and it's because really strength is pretty narrow. Like it's hard to say what that actually means. And I think when we've had clients kind of go through their networks and decide who they're okay with defining as connectors, especially people that have been at this for years, that process can take a long time. There's a lot of hemming and hawing, and that list gets like really whittled down. So I'm trying to bring this to a question, but I'm just sort of like, how do you deal with that the right way? How do you kind of like make that happen in a software context where you do have to quantify it some way?
Yeah, I mean, we think there's all different types of connectors, some that are super excited and proactive that come into our system and want to add all their relationships and rate the relationship strength. And those are easy, right? Then there are those that are incredibly protective, are concerned about, revealing any relationships, do not want to necessarily be, as open, right? With sort of relationship strength. And so we've built a system that kind of can cater to both, which is they're able to now come in and participate, but in a way that protects who they might know and who they might not. They can simply offer help into a target company through an indirect relationship. We give them the opportunity to see people that the sales team is trying to meet, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they've said that they know that person. Maybe they know someone that knows that person, but we've taken all those things into consideration, because you're absolutely right. Relationships are an incredibly nuanced thing. Everybody's different, and you kind of need to give them the freedom to treat those relationships the way they best are suited. And so that's also why we give connectors the ability to make these introductions either through affordable email, through a text, through a phone call, through whatever format they feel is best suited for that personal relationship or that professional one that they've got, because that flexibility is super important.
Yeah, that makes sense. One thing that we've seen come up a lot is the seniority level issue with sales teams, right? Where you might have partners that have this massive Rolodex and, have built it for a long time, but they have salespeople that are newer, younger, that might not have that Rolodex built up. So the partners will say, "Hey, you can use my Rolodex," but then the issue with that is sometimes it takes time, right, to make these intros and to be involved and to even get on calls and that kind of thing. So this is probably even a bigger issue when you're dealing with a full stack sales team where you have a lot of new people coming in. Can you talk about that a little bit, kind of how you deal with the seniority thing?
Well, let me know if I answer your question and correct me if I don't. But one thing that we've built into our system are reminders, and a system where you can see those that are requested, those that are active, and you can update the status or the stages of where an introduction is. And so we give connectors the ability to adjust the frequency of those notifications, of those reminders, but it's a really effective way to keep them reminded of what's sort of next, right, in the process. And because when they get introduction requests coming from the salesperson routed through SmallWorld, they can organize all those into sort of one folder. So one thing we've heard is these connectors, to your point, are super busy. They'll often forget. They've got a lot of things going on. And so we've, again, tried to take that into account with how we are that one place and one system of record where all of these are funneled through. So, but did I answer your question on the seniority thing, or were you kind of?
I think so. So if I understand right, it sounds like you're creating just kind of visibility across the whole team. You can see kind of who's connected to who.
You can, and those senior people are in control over whether or not they are willing to make the introduction. If they get a request that maybe doesn't have as much context or justification behind it, they can actually request more from the rep, right? So our idea is all around this concept of making the rep do what they would expect to do if they were going to get a cold email responded to, which is to provide that connector with context. But they'll accelerate the whole process by using someone who knows that person they're trying to meet with versus doing it through cold outreach.
Got it. Yeah, that makes sense. And is the anchor to this LinkedIn? Is that kind of the main source of these connections, or is it self-uploaded, or what's kind of fueling this?
Yeah, I mean, we look at relationships broad, and their personal relationships and their professional relationships, and we bring in data from multiple sources. So LinkedIn connections is one good place for professional connections. There are some people that are not as active on LinkedIn as others. There is an increasingly there's unreliability in terms of the relationship strength, right? Connections are becoming more and more a poor proxy for relationship strength because it's audience building a lot on LinkedIn right now. You have a lot of people that are accepting connections to be able to have an audience and promote, and it's content sharing. So one of the problems that we certainly solve is by helping curate those LinkedIn connections and to identify the ones where there are real relationships and the ones that frankly are within the personas and the ICPs of who the company cares about. But we pull in Gmail data, we pull in address book data. We're agnostic, because when you think about community, when you think about clubs and associations, when you think about who on a personal level, that transcends what might be seen just on LinkedIn. Last thing I'll add here is what's really interesting, that we're beginning to surface our third-degree relationships. And so third-degree relationships only matter when there's a very, very strong relationship between two people, because if, for example, if you and I had a very strong relationship, someone that who maybe had previous work history at a company that I'm trying to get into, all of a sudden becomes really relevant. Because of the strength of our relationship, your willingness to help me out just based on the trust. is dramatically different than if you didn't have a very strong relationship with me. So we're revealing new paths of connectivity that otherwise salespeople would be blind to on LinkedIn and other sources, that we think is really interesting to open up sort of the aperture of opportunity.
Yeah, and I could see that there is that huge quality over quantity effect where it's like, okay, if your best friend is connected to the CMO, you should probably start here instead of doing more cold outreach, right? So that makes sense.
Yeah, and then looking, that CMO worked at this company for 5 years, and so asking a favor, right, of somebody that you have that very strong relationship becomes now more in play than it would if it was just a regular connection.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it's funny because one shower thought I've had that I kind of got parts of it into that book earlier is the idea that like there's something inherently scarce about relationships, and what we're both doing from different angles is essentially giving intelligence on that. But at the end of the day, one question that I'll get is like, well, let's say I don't have a relationship and I don't have any connection to this CMO or whoever it is. Like, can I still, like, what do we do? And it's like, well, yeah, you can still reach out to them. It's just going to be a lot harder. And when I see other people with sales software platforms and stuff, especially with AI, this is going to take a lot of weird, crazy directions pretty soon. It's kind of this like personalization arms race, but all of it's going to like accumulate to being something that is very commonplace, right? Where it's regurgitating information back to somebody about things you know about them, but there's nothing scarce about it, which makes it unreliable. So anyway,
That's
I don't
right.
have a question, but how do you feel about that? Like, how does that match your take on the
Yeah,
world?
no, I think you're spot on. I mean, I think, I heard it the other day. It was like, everybody thinks this is going to help, with cold outreach because you're going to have the perfect email with relevant content. Well, now everybody's email looks the same. And so now you don't trust any of those emails as a target prospect because you know that they were generated by AI potentially. And so I think the willingness to actually be receptive to that will be important. I think it's a combination of using AI for formatting, for kind of the skeleton of content, and then really being smart about how you personalize it. That'll make a huge difference. And then being really effective on the call once you get it, right? It's one thing to secure that meeting, but then being able to, with credibility, articulate what you wrote in that email. If AI is writing all this, you didn't really know it, and then you are caught flat-footed, your credibility is out the window. So the way that, we look at the world is sales is about timing or trust. And timing is important. You need to have your brand top of mind when somebody goes through a vendor change, or they're in the process of issuing an RFP, or third party intent data has been really popular because that's timing, right? They're in the midst of shopping for a new solution. But trust is this really interesting opportunity to unlock that exists within every company. And what's equally interesting with trust is that it's with an audience that may not even know that they have a problem we're solving at that given moment. They're perfectly teed up. They're perhaps in the right vertical. You've got case studies and examples of where you've delivered value to this exact same person with the exact same title, with the exact same business challenges, but they're blind to the fact that there's a solution out there that could help them do this. They're not going to respond to any cold outreach, and they're not even going to show you indications of shopping because they're not there yet. But you get that audience through the power of trust. And so you've opened up a world of opportunities that otherwise would have not been accessible through a relationship. And we think it's this combination of timing and trust, which creates the perfect bullseye for salespeople.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think that trust is actually the scarce resource for anything that's not brand new, for anything that has enough competition around it. Cause it's like, at the end of the day, especially in our world of agency services, everybody knows what an agency does. It's more about which one can actually trust to do the things that it says it's going to do, right? So that makes a lot of sense to me. I think to shift gears a little bit, I think a lot of people listening, they probably have a CRM, they're on a HubSpot or they're on a Pipedrive or whatever. And maybe there's one or two other tools that are going around. Like, where does SmallWorld fit in? Like, how do you think about slotting this into place with everything else?
Yeah, so we currently have an integration into Salesforce, which for any of our customers that use Salesforce, they're accessing it there for just that reason, to make it part of the workflow for reps who come in the morning, they log in, they're responding to their marketing qualified leads or their intent leads, and then we're surfacing what we describe as relationship leads. So now, instead of doing what would have been cold outreach into those target accounts. They're able to leverage an existing relationship that we've surfaced for them in Salesforce to do the same thing and to increase the chances of engagement. We have plans to do an integration with HubSpot and other applications where we will be a good fit. And so that process is underway. But today we've got a nice, robust integration with Salesforce that we're excited about.
Cool. That's, and I don't mean just integrations, but I guess a better way to ask the question is, which is very interesting, by the way, and that's a good thing to have. But what's the sort of process that you recommend to salespeople that are doing this? Like, are relationships first? Is it inbound? Like, is it the cold lead that did respond? How does this kind of slot into place? Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Sorry, I didn't answer it the first time. I think, it's about those deal velocity metrics we talked about, right? So if you are looking to generate more pipeline, start with intent, start with MQLs. Be sure that those are high quality. Now, the big benefit of using relationships is you're going to get into senior level decision makers more quickly. Typically with these inbound MQLs and intent, you're talking to manager level, director level, not a bad thing because they're end users and they're influencers. But if you really want to get access for your, AE or strategic AE into the C-suite or into a level decision maker, relationships may be the place to start. We also like to describe what we do as providing teams with the ability to do a relationship audit on an important deal in the pipeline. So let's say that a deal's gotten to stage 3 or 4, it's a sizable deal, maybe it's competitive. What you don't want to do is look back having lost that deal and later learn that maybe your CFO had a great relationship with their CFO through a peer group, and it was never leveraged as part of that sales process, bringing that CFO into a team-based selling strategy. So we like to encourage customers to do a relationship audit for any important deal in the pipeline, and that's a great place as a strategic rep to leverage SmallWorld. We also think about account planning and account mapping and prioritization. And so you can organize all of your territory in SmallWorld in such a way where you can see where you have relationships across each of them, the strength of those relationships. And oftentimes that'll inform of the 100 accounts you've been assigned, which are the top 15 based on these relationships, because your propensity and likelihood of getting a meeting through one of these connectors is much higher than it otherwise would be. So those are, when we think about sort of the activities and responsibilities of a salesperson, some of the places where we are really well suited to help.
Yeah, that's cool. And one thing that kind of popped up as you were talking is that in the relationship audit is this sort of later stage deal scenario where it's like, let's say you're, in our world, you're an agency and you have this big, RFP you're working on, and you're like among the top 3 in contention, and you find out that your creative director went to college or is friends with, the VP of marketing. He's been on the sidelines, hasn't really been involved in the deal. What's your play there once you find that out? Like, what are people doing, and what's diplomatic at that stage?
I mean, I think that's where, again, it's this notion of trust. And the way, back to kind of like what inspired this, I always believed there was, the decision maker at this target prospect, they have a life. They know people, in their community. They've worked with people before. And just through personal experience, oh my gosh, I had no idea you knew this person, right? It's so crazy. My co-founder, Matt, and I met through someone who we both had a very strong relationship with, but we didn't know that. And so I think this notion of it being a smaller world than we all think is just true. And so through trust, because ultimately you make a decision on a vendor because of either trust in their solutions, and that you'll be recognized once that solution delivers on its promise, or trust in the person that they'll deliver against what they promise. And so I think anytime that trust is known, it's super appropriate, even if it's later, in the process, to engage someone who can influence an opportunity if it's done the right way.
Yeah, and I think sometimes it might be more like, hey, how can we best represent it? Like asking for, if you ask for advice, you get help. If you ask for help, you get advice, kind of thing. I've seen that play out well. So it makes a lot of sense.
Exactly.
So David, this has been really great, and it's great to compare notes on this stuff. Getting towards the end of the time here, how can people follow what you're up to and check out SmallWorld and get in touch and all that good stuff?
Yeah, so we're at smallworld.ai, and would love to chat more about what we're doing. And we've got a self-guided product tour on our website, some informative videos, and obviously would be excited to dig in more. We work with companies across verticals, technology, consulting, business services, and work with revenue leaders of all kinds. We work with ABM and executive engagement teams, sales and marketing teams, and we're super excited about the results that we're seeing. So appreciate the opportunity to tell our story.
Yeah, likewise, and we'll get all that linked up, and hopefully we'll do it again before long. So thank you, sir. Appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely.